Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. This is a video about speedy sewing tips, a video where I'm sharing my best advice that I've gleaned over the last 15 years or so of sewing experience, both personal and professional, that I have had that I'd like to share with you. So in this video I am going to be making up a batch of NHS hospital scrubs that I am sewing as a volunteer project through the For the Love of Scrubs project that you can find over on Facebook. Relevant links will be found below this video in the show notes. And this video will not provide a detailed step-by-step how to, draft a pair of scrubs or sew a pair of scrubs, because according to the pattern that you're making and, the requirements that you're personally working with, it may vary. So this is more of a general sewing tips video, but the examples that I'm going to be using in the video are a batch of 5 plain black scrubs made from polycotton, as well as an additional extra jazzy pair of scrubs that I am sewing out of this material, which I'm sewing for my friend as a gift, who is an NHS doctor, for her to wear on non-COVID-19 wards, doing the very, very important job of, surveying patients, but I'm doing the important job of entertainment and raising morale, at least let's hope, with this pair of scrubs that I'm giving my friend. As I said, this is more general tips and advice, and it can obviously apply to any sewing projects at all, not just scrubs. And the advice in this video also can be applied to, a long stint sewing one item where you just want to speed things up and get going and work more efficiently. But it is also applicable if you are sewing multiple items in batches, as I am doing with my set of 5 identical scrubs. So without further ado, let's get going. So here is my workspace. It's pretty small. It's a table in my bay window, and my very first tip might sound quite obvious, but it's actually really important, and it's just to clear and set up your working space. So get rid of any house plants, pots of pens, ornaments, anything like that you're not going to be used. You just need to have a clear surface. Now I'm using my domestic overlocker and a domestic sewing machine for my sewing projects, which is what I use for pretty much everything. And as part of setting up your sewing space, you just want to make sure that you've got all of your essential tools to hand. So I've just pulled out of my much larger sewing toolbox just the essential things that I'm going to need, and I've just put them in this little handy tray. So I've got my pin cushion with different pins and safety pins, my snips, needle and a little bit of beeswax in case I need to finish anything off by hand, an unpicker just in case anything goes wrong, extra sewing needles, really important, a thimble, again just in case I need to do some hand sewing, you never know, a tape measure, and then I've also got a hair elastic in here because you just never know when they're going to come in handy. So as you can see, I've completely cleared my surface, and I'm just pointing out that I am literally sewing in my bay window because I don't have a very large space to work with, and I don't have a dedicated sewing studio. As part of getting ready, I've also got out my iron and my ironing board, and I've made sure that I've sorted out my extension cord and that everything is ready to plug in and go without any obstructions. My next step is to wind up some bobbins in the relevant colour thread, and it's really important that you don't just wind up one bobbin, especially if you've got a large batch of things to be sewing, but actually you go ahead and wind up 2 or 3 bobbins so that they're all ready to go. You don't have to keep stopping and starting. So I've just wound up 2 bobbins there because I'm going to be using my overlocker for quite a lot of this project. However, if you don't have an overlocker and you're going to be zigzagging the raw edges of your cloth, then definitely wind up 3, especially if you've got a big batch. And then the next thing to do is to do your stitch sample right at the beginning so that you can identify any tension issues. And as part of that, do check that the needle is still sharp. I'm touching this with my foot definitely far away from the pedal. Check the needle is still sharp. I've changed this very recently, but it might be a good idea to change to a brand new needle. So I'm just checking that my tension is good on both sides, and I already did an overlocking sample earlier, and I'm all good and ready to go. Just before I start any actual stitching, tip number 4 is to make sure that you're staying hydrated. So keep a bottle of water, not an open jug, Ask me how I know, or just use your imagination. Keep a bottle of water somewhere near your sewing space, maybe down on the floor, or probably not on the surface. And, you know, make sure that you keep drinking. It sounds really obvious, but when you've got a long stint of sewing ahead of you, or when you just really get into a project, you don't want to have to keep stopping and running off to the kitchen to get a drink. Just have it close at hand. Make sure that the lid's on. And also, if you're using filtered water or if tap water is suitable for your iron, this bottle of water can also double up to refill your iron's steam tank when it runs dry. So it's just generally handy to have around. Tip number 5 is actually the most important tip, and that is to look through the instructions and figure out which are the steps in the instructions where you're essentially doing the same thing, and divide up all of the different processes into batches. For example, here I know that I have to press all of these pieces in half, but I also have to hem down the tops of these pockets, so I can do a whole bunch of pressing right at the beginning and get all of those jobs done while I have the iron out and heated up. This saves a lot of time as you don't have to keep stopping and starting. Work in batches for absolutely everything. So here I am prepping my neckband pieces onto the front yoke of the scrub. So I'm laying it on, matching up the edges, and then leaving them there. So working in batches is also going to apply to your actual stitching, and this is where it's quite important to have looked ahead in the instructions of what you're doing so that you can figure out if you can carry out multiple iterations of exactly the same task all in the same sitting. For example, I know that I'm going to be overlocking on the neckband facing onto the front yoke of my scrubs as I've just been preparing at the ironing board, and I'm doing that with the overlocker again to save time because I have an overlocker, so I'm not going to be stitching down and then overlocking again. I'm just going to overlock it all together. However, I've also got my back neck facings because while I'm at the overlocker I can overlock the raw edge of that, and I've got a big pile of pockets because again I can be doing all of the overlocking all at once and get it all out of the way. When you're doing lots of stitching of the same type, especially overlocking, you don't need to keep stopping and snipping off the threads and rejoining it every time. You can just overlock a little bit more and then pop in the next piece to overlock, and then at the end you'll be snipping away all of the overlocked joins, leaving a little bit of excess thread so that it won't fray away. Now that I've got pretty much all of my overlocking out of the way, I've unplugged it and pushed it to the back, and now I'm going to be stitching on my sewing machine instead, just doing straight stitching. And again, I'm doing all of my straight plain stitching all at once as one task. So I've got loads of pockets that I have to pop the hem onto, and I also have to stay stitch the back neckline of this back piece. I'm not going to be stopping and starting. The idea is to do as much of the same task as possible and keep going. So same as with the overlocking, with the pockets, I'm just holding it down and stitching, and I'm going to be chain piecing them, so I'll do them all at once and I'll just leave a little bit of thread in between, and then afterwards I will snip away and cut them apart from each other. So that's my first one hemmed, and I'll just pull out some thread and I'll get the next one into position. And if you want to reverse stitch to secure the stitching, you can do that in this process as well. You just have to take care to position the foot and the needle carefully. But if you don't want to, you don't need to, because you will be stitching back alongside this hem in the opposite direction, which will secure it into place. So just to demonstrate that, I've just reversed, and then I'll stitch down the hem. And then I can do a reverse stitching at the end, and then I'll just line up my next piece, and then as you can see, I've got all of my pieces are all connected onto this thread chain, so at the end I will be snipping them apart, but not until I have done all of the straight stitching on this entire batch of hem pieces. Stop and have a little break in between your tasks, especially when you are sewing a large batch of things and you've got loads of overlocking to do, or you've got loads of straight stitches to do, or ironing, whatever the specific task at hand is. You could be sitting down, stooped over, doing the same thing for quite a lot of time. So it's really important to take a moment to pause, get up off your chair, stretch, go and get a snack, go and have a drink, physically get up and have some movement in between your tasks. Again, this might seem, irrelevant to sewing or really basic and obvious, but trust me, it is not. I'm speaking from experience. When you're right in the middle of sewing, you don't want to suddenly be desperate for the toilet, or, you don't want to suddenly get like a shooting pain up your neck, or cramps, or, muscle spasms or anything like that. You don't want that to happen at all, but you definitely don't want it to happen when you're right in the middle of a task, especially if it's something fiddly or complicated. So just as soon as you've finished doing, whatever specific job it is that you're doing, force yourself to get up and stretch. And it doesn't have to be for very long. At the moment, I'm having a little break talking to you, and I've also put on a pot of coffee. I'm now going to do a little bit more stitching, and when that batch of things is done, I'm going to press the plunger on my cafetiere, and then I'll drink the coffee. So you can space it out with different tasks that you've got going around the home, and just other things that you need to do in general. But please make sure that you take those breaks. They're actually really, really important to completing successful sewing projects and staying healthy and happy. When you're stitching, use as few pins as possible. Just pin in key places and use your hand to stabilize the fabric as you sew. I'm just popping in one pin at a time, just literally to hold them in place as I transport them from the ironing board onto my sewing table. And I'm always making sure that if I use any pins, I put them in with the point facing up against the raw edge so that it's really easy to pull them out as I'm sewing. You'll have noticed already that most of the sewing I've been doing, I haven't used any pins at all because they were very simple, long straight lines, and I could just hold the fabric up to the sewing machine and it was very easy to control. So here I'm stitching on the back neck facing onto the back neck, and it's curved, so it could be a little bit more difficult. So all I'm doing is literally putting in one pin in the middle, because the edges I will just hold together and take to the machine and sew round. If you've been stitching and stitching away and you still don't quite feel satisfied with the speed of your sewing at the sewing machine, look into the particular settings of your sewing machine, because sometimes there's a couple of small things that can be adjusted here to improve your speed. So the first thing is the stitch length. You want to check out your stitch length and make sure that you're not sewing with too short a stitch length, because this basically means that you're putting more stitches into the same amount of space, which is obviously going to take longer. Now this is going to vary for you. My sewing machine has settings from 0 to 5, and 5 is the length for basting or tacking stitches or gathering, so that's not going to be suitable for normal stitching, normal seam lines, because it's not going to be strong enough. So generally I sew at about a 3, sometimes a 3.5 length, sometimes a 4. The exact stitch length that you choose is going to vary according to your project and the particular needs there. For example, the thickness of the fabric, the type of thread that you're using, and so on and so forth. But do look into the stitch length. And the second thing to look into is if there are actually any speed settings on your sewing machine or your sewing machine foot. So here you can see that my Benina sewing machine foot does actually have a minimum and maximum speed, so you obviously want to make sure that that is set to maximum. And again, this is going to vary according to whatever make and model of machine that you personally have. My last tip is to learn key measurements and distances for your sewing by eye, so that you don't have to keep stopping and checking. This is a really, really useful skill that you will take forward. The reason for that is simply that you don't want to have to spend time stopping and checking every time. So I've started off by folding down what I think is 2 centimeters. Once I've done that, I just want to make sure that I've memorized that. And if you're feeling unsure, just every so often, just whip up that tape measure and double check, and here it's spot on, so I'm absolutely fine. By the way, be careful keeping a tape measure around your neck when you are ironing. Again, ask me how I know and how difficult it is to peel melted tape measure off fabric. So there you have it, my 10 best sewing tips for faster, more efficient and overall easier fuss-free sewing. I really hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you try out any of the methods that I've suggested in this video, please do drop me a comment down below and let me know. And also, I would absolutely love to know if you have any additional ideas of things that we can do in order to speed up our sewing and just make it more of a streamlined experience. Drop me a comment down below and let me know what you've been sewing lately. And if you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel for regular vlogs about what I've been making, as well as useful tutorials, hints and tips from me. So I've had an extremely busy day and I've managed to complete this stack of scrubs, including the novelty scrubs for my friend. My friend has promised photographic and video evidence of her wearing her fancy scrubs on the ward, so I'll be sure to update you guys on this channel with that when I have it. Take care everybody, happy sewing, bye bye.